Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come out to Edinburgh to talk about a project I've been involved with for getting on for 30 years now, the reconstruction of an ancient Greek trireme. And I always begin by saying a little bit about what a trireme was, and I always start with this slide. The trireme was the most ubiquitous and most important warship type of the ancient Mediterranean. It was in use by both Greek and Roman navies from the late 6th century BC right through to the early 4th century AD. So as a ship type, it has a lifespan of almost a millennium, mainly used in the Mediterranean, but even the British fleet under the Roman Empire is known to have had at least one trireme. And what was it? It was an oared warship principally designed for ramming, as depicted here in this painting by very well-known illustrator of historical topics, the late Peter Connolly. Rather good depiction of the greatest trireme battle ever, the Battle of Salamis, 480 BC, whose 2,500th anniversary is coming up in 2021. I've just come back from Salamis, where they're certainly thinking about that. And one can quibble about various details of the depiction. I don't quite understand how, when they've just had this enormous collision, all these people are still on their feet. But that's really a small quibble. Why it's significant is because when Peter Connolly published this in 1981, so 33 years ago, the way he depicted the triremes was absolutely not the orthodox view of how they were constructed. He has shown them with the oars arranged at 3 levels. So there's one level of oars there, a middle level of oars there, and the bottom level of oars there. And most classical scholars did not believe that that was possible at the time. In 1981, they believed that these ships had to be rowed at a single level, like Renaissance galleys. It was in fact one of the oldest controversies in classical scholarship. It's something which ancient historians had discussed going right back to the early 16th century, and at that time indeed it was discussed as a practical matter because oared galleys were still very much in use in the Mediterranean, and not just historians, but rulers were interested in how it might have been possible to row these ships at 3 levels, and could this be a better way of doing it than the Mediterranean way, with all the rowers arranged at 1 level with several men to an oar. The orthodoxy for much of the next 500 years was that the ships were rowed at 3 levels until about the 17th century. A galley captain of Louis XIV pointed out that actually it would be very difficult to row at 3 different levels, because if you had oars at 3 different levels, the oars at the top level would have to be longer than the oars at the middle level, which would have to be longer than the oars at the lowest level, and that would make it almost impossible to gear the oars so that they'd have the same gearing at the 3 levels, and so that the oarsmen could row in time. So that became a bit of a controversy, which continued right into the 20th century, by when, for reasons which I'll explain in a second, the orthodoxy had become that it was definitely impossible to row the ships at 3 levels. That was until it was questioned in the late 1930s by this man, John Morrison, very distinguished Greek scholar, who was then starting out his career at Trinity College, Cambridge, and his interest was in ancient philosophy, and he was having trouble understanding a passage of Plato's Republic, where Plato, in one of his flights of fancies, describes the universe as being held together by a great shaft of light, which is like the undergirdings, the µ of a trireme. And John tried to find out what these undergirdings were, and nobody could explain it to him, and that created this lifelong interest in triremes. And he very quickly came to the conclusion that the ships were indeed rowed at 3 levels, but absolutely none of his classical scholars would believe him. Indeed, a fellow of his own college at Cambridge, Trinity, a man called Tarn, who was the world expert on ancient ships of the time, told John in no uncertain terms that he was absolutely wrong and that he should stick to philosophy, which only spurred him on, I'm happy to say. And so sceptical was the classical world that actually John couldn't get his work published in any classical journal. In the end, he had to publish his hypothesis in the Mariner's Mirror, which is a journal for people interested in nautical history, which classicists never read. And he kept trying to persuade people for the next 20 odd years or so, but nobody would listen. In 1968, he decided to try and collect together all the information that we have about these ships, from literary texts, from inscriptions, from vase paintings, from reliefs, from remains of their ship sheds in which they were housed. And he published this with a man called Williams in 1968, and the book was hailed as a fantastic collection of data and sources, but it was absolutely panned in all the reviews for its trying to reconstruct ships on 3 levels. That was 1968. So when John finally retired in 1979, by which time he'd become president of Wilson College, Cambridge, a very distinguished figure in the University of Cambridge, he thought he was going to have one more go. And this time, in reaction to the criticism to his 1968 book, he decided he would enlist the help of, I'll come back to those in a minute, of a naval architect, this man, John Coates. John Coates had just retired also in 1979 as Chief Naval Architect to the Ministry of Defence. He had designed a whole generation of the Royal Navy's warships and was interested in ancient shipping, and they made a deal amongst themselves that John Morrison would give John Coates all the information he had about these ships, and John Coates would try and design a viable trireme from that information. One reason they had to do this is we have no warship wrecks from the ancient Mediterranean. We have well over 1,000 merchant ship wrecks from antiquity, no warship wrecks, again for reasons I'll come into shortly. Just to go back to explain why the orthodoxy in the 20th century had very much become that these ships weren't rowed at 3 levels, it was really because of this find. This is the so-called ᶜᵏᵉ relief, named after the French archaeologist who discovered it on the Acropolis of Athens, somewhere in the Erechion, in 1859. And when it was found, it caused enormous excitement because, sure enough, here it is showing what is almost certainly a trireme of around about 500 BC, and quite clearly you've got rowers rowing, the top level of rowers rowing like that, their oars, the middle level of oars, and the bottom level of oars. The 3-level hypothesis seemed to have been proved and caused huge stir in the classical world. Also of interest, incidentally, all the rowers are rowing naked, which has always intrigued me, and I often wondered whether this was just artistic license. But it's interesting that in the last 20 years or 25 years there's been a vogue for rowing across the Atlantic, and one of the things that the people who row across the Atlantic have discovered is that if you keep on rowing and there's lots of salt water about, your clothes get very stiff very quickly, and so they end up rowing naked, sitting on a sheepskin, which is exactly what it seems to have been the case in antiquity. So I think that is genuine that they rowed naked. Anyway, the ᶜᵏᵉ relief caused huge excitement, especially back in France. Of course, this was a French archaeologist who discovered it, who supposedly solved the puzzle. At that time, France was under the control of Napoleon III, who had enormous interest in antiquity, especially Roman antiquity. In Julius Caesar, he saw himself as a successor to the Caesars, and being an antiquarian and an emperor, he was able to order his navy to build him a trireme. A rowroom trireme, fair enough, but nevertheless a trireme. Got the leading naval architect of the day to design it, Dupuy de l'Homme, who was famous for building La Gloire, which is the ironclad ship to which the Warrior was the Royal Navy's response, so a very advanced naval architect. And he built Napoleon a trireme, rowed at 3 levels, as the ᶜᵏᵉ relief showed, and this took to the waters of the Seine in 1861 with Napoleon and the Empress Eugénie on board, rowed at 3 levels, and the top level of oars was longer than the middle level of oars, which was longer than the lowest level of oars, and as predicted, it didn't get anywhere and was a complete disaster. Napoleon and Eugénie sort of stomped off it in disgust, and the last we hear of it is an order from the Naval Ministry in Paris that it should be used to test a new type of torpedo. But this is why, by the early 20th century, nobody believed in the 3-level system. Except, of course, for Hollywood. Hollywood thought, well, of course a trireme has to have 3 levels, so when they made the 1927 Ben-Hur, they had their rowers at 3 levels. And all the classicists, especially Sir William Tarn, laughed their heads off and said, that's Hollywood for you. But they were wrong, we think. So there you are, you never know. Hollywood may be getting stuff right that we are currently sneering about. You should never be too sure. Anyway, I just want to go very briefly through the evidence that John Morrison gave to John Coates as the basis of his reconstruction. Some of it was iconographic evidence, visual evidence, in this case from a vase of around 400 BC, about the same time as the ├ᵉᵗ relief. This is the vase itself showing Jason and the Argonauts. There's Jason climbing onto the stern of the Argo, which appears to be depicted as a three-level ship. That's how it looks like on the vase. That's what it would look like if what John Morrison called these rather irritating people are removed and you can see what's going on. Actually, there's nothing over here that isn't based on something over here. And what you've got is a bracket, what rowers call an outrigger, at the top level to support the top level of oars. You've got oar ports for the middle level of oars, and slightly larger oar ports for the lower level of oars, and they've got something inside them, and we know that what that is from literary texts, from Aristophanes' comedy. These are leather sleeves to stop the water coming in at the lowest level, because those oar ports are really quite close to the water. So this definitely does seem to show a three-level ship, like the ├ᵉᵗ relief. And this is an Athenian vase found in southern Italy. Move it along like that. Some of the key evidence for John Coates actually came from the remains of the sheds in which these ships were housed. These ships were very delicate. They had to be taken out of the water over the winter, and they had to be specially housed to keep the sun and the rain off them. And the buildings that were designed to house them were very specialised indeed. Indeed, I've just finished a big 10-year project studying these, which was published only a few weeks ago. And these buildings are designed so that you can draw these very long, narrow ships up out of the water and then launch them again safely. And that's not at all easy. The gradient of the sheds is very important. But what you can see here are the best preserved of all the ship sheds known from the ancient Mediterranean at a rather obscure place called Oiniardi in western Greece. And what you see here are the columns dividing the individual sheds and the ramps up which the ships were drawn up. And you can see the ramps curve up at the stern to support the curving stern of these ships. So this is an aerial photo. These are the only sheds for which we have the lower end. And we've been desperate to find out what actually happens at the lower end, but they've never been properly excavated or measured, and we keep trying to get the excavator to go and let us measure them. We're going to have another go in March. But this is a small set of sheds for just 6 triremes. We think this was an Athenian outpost in the mid-4th century BC. And this is just to show how the triremes fitted into the sheds. They were drawn up onto these ramps. The ramps are hollow here, we think, because these were filled with sand into which you laid cross timbers. You can't draw a wooden keel up a pebble beach or over rock, because the coefficient of friction is too great. It simply requires too much of an effort. You have to draw wood over wood, and the wood has to be in the form of sleepers put crossways into the sand so they bed in as the keel slides over them. These are really artificial beaches, covered artificial beaches, if you like, for preserving the ships. The important thing about them is they give the maximum length of a ship and especially important, they gave a maximum width of the ship. So they gave John Coates a set of dimensions for the ships, even though we have no wrecks. The earliest ones excavated were excavated in the 1880s at Zea Harbour, one of the three harbours of the Piraeus. Athens had an enormous set of these sheds. They had 372 sheds altogether to house their fleet of 400 or so triremes. A huge expense, dwarfs the expense of even the largest temples built anywhere in Greece, Athens or anywhere else. Very, very expensive and costly. It was felt necessary to house the ships, to protect them, as they say, from water and from the sun. And these were the earliest excavated, as I say, in 1885 by a local school teacher, who's this character here, ᶃᵒᵐᵐᵉ, who very fortunately had to help him a man called Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who was the leading German archaeologist of the day. He'd just come back from Troy, where he'd been digging with Schliemann. And Dörpfeld fortunately recorded these sheds, and these are the ones that gave the dimensions for our reconstruction, for John Coates' reconstruction. And this is just a section through the sheds to show what they're like. The ship's drawn up on a ramp like this, which is built up in this case, whereas at ᵒᵏᵉ the ramp was cut into the rock. Here they had to actually build the ramp up because of the local topography. Covered, each shed covered with its own little roof. And that, again, gives you an impression of what these sheds were like, and how they give us the dimensions of the width in particular. The length is more of a problem, but it still gives us an idea. Coates needed to design the ship using the ancient Mediterranean form of construction. As I've said before, we have no warship wrecks at all from the ancient Mediterranean. That may be about to change. In the last 3 years, a large number of rams from a naval battle have been dredged up off the coast of Sicily, which we think are connected with the naval battle of 241 BC. And it looks as if they actually came from ships which had sunk. So if some of those did sink and sank into the mud somewhere, they might still be down there. But there's a special reason why those particular ships may have sunk. Mostly, ancient warships didn't sink, and that's why we don't have the wrecks. We have lots of merchant ship wrecks, because merchant ships always are either carrying cargo, or when they're not carrying cargo, they have to carry ballast, usually in the form of stones, so that they float at the right level to sail properly. And when you knock a hole in a merchant ship, it's the cargo that takes it, or the ballast that takes it down to the bottom. Warships were built for speed and maneuverability, so they carried no cargo, no ballast. The ballast, in fact, was the oarsman. Our reconstruction displaces about 40-45 tons, fully laden with the crew aboard. The crew are something like 15 of those tons, so about a third of the total displacement. What happens when you knock a hole in an ancient warship is your ballast gets out as quickly as it can, and you end up with something which floats about. And this is not just conjecture. We have literary texts which talk about what happens after a battle is the victors go round collecting up the destroyed hold ships of the enemy and salvaging them. Indeed, there is one case in Xenophon, 4th century historian, where a Spartan admiral escapes on a ship which has been sunk. And we would be mistranslating the word for sunk, ᶃᵃဍρειν. It's not sunk, it just means it's swamped. And it is sort of lolling about, and you can just about move it. So that's why we have no warship wrecks so far. Maybe, as I say, it's about to change for particular reasons. We do, however, have lots of merchant shipwrecks, so we know how these ships were built, how the shells were built. And they were built in a different way from the tradition in Northern Europe. In Northern Europe, you build the ribs of the ship first, and then you attach planking. Planking is often overlapping, clinker construction. Sometimes you create a smooth shell, carvel construction, but it's still attached to a frame, and the strength is in the ribs, in the frame. In the ancient Mediterranean, you build the ship shell first and add the frames later, and they're just stiffeners. So they are secondary, if you like. The strength of a ship is in the actual shell. And the shell is held together by thousands and thousands of mortise and tenon joints. A mortise is a slot you cut in the thickness of the planking. You insert a hardwood tenon into it, then you drill through the planking and the tenon, you insert pegs to hold it all together. This is a demonstration piece of a mortise and tenon joint. These are mortises actually being cut in our reconstruction, so it looks like from the outside. It's all very difficult to then fit together. This is another reconstruction. This is a merchant ship reconstruction, Trireme 1, which was done in the 80s, I think. And you can see they've cut the mortises into the thickness of that plank, strake. They then inserted all these tenons. They then got mortises cut in this plank, and you have to fit it all together. Very difficult job, especially since the mortises have to be very tight in order for the ship, for the hull not to flex too much. And that's Olympias actually being built in this way. All these are not structural at all. They're simply former's guides for the boat builders. All this came out when the ship was built. So the strength was in the hull. It does create a very strong hull, so much so that a 40-metre trireme, 6 metres wide, would not have been insured by Lloyd's of London in the 19th century. It would have exceeded the permissible parameters by 50%. They would have said, you cannot build a ship this long and narrow. It will simply break in two. The reason it doesn't is partly because of this sort of construction, mortise and tenon construction. Our reconstruction has 20,000 mortise and tenon joints. So that's a lot of joints. All in the ancient world, of course, done by hand. We used machines, I'm sorry to say. But it wasn't that sort of experiment. Okay, so John had the length and width of the ship. He knew it had to be built with mortise and tenon construction, which results in this characteristic wine glass shape for the hull. And in that, he had to fit 170 rowers. We know the figures from inscriptions from Athens, also from literary texts. We also know how they were arranged within the hull. There were 62 rowers at the top level, 54 at the middle level, 54 at the bottom. That's 170 in total. We also know how long the oars were, because various inscriptions, naval inventories, inscribed on stone from 4th century BC from Athens, give us the length of the oars in various ships. And they're either 9 or 9.5 cubits long. The cubits, the distance from your elbow to the tip of your finger. Conventionally, it's 1.5 foot long. A cubit is 1.5 feet. So we know that the oars were about 4 meters long. And what John Morrison had done was demonstrated that you could arrange these oars of the same length at 3 different levels and they would still reach the water. And that's what John Coates had to do. He had to arrange 62 oars up here, 54 there, 54 there, and they all had to reach the water even though they were the same length, about 4 meters, and so on. And the more that Coates tried to design a ship that fitted the parameters provided by the ancient evidence, the more constrained he found his design to be. He really found that he could only design it in one particular way, and also that he could only place the oarsmen in very specific places. He could only move them a few centimetres each way for it all to work. In shipbuilding, if you change one thing, it affects everything else. That's absolutely normal, and this is particularly true for this design. As an example of this, the stability of any ship depends very greatly on the breadth of a ship at the waterline amidships, because that affects something called the geometric height, GM, which is the measure of stability of a ship. So had Coates designed this ship as it was designed, with a width of waterline of about 3.5 meters, it was completely stable. But as you reduce that distance, the geometric height, which is the measure of the stability of a ship, is affected as a cube of that distance. In other words, the effect is cubed. So if it had been 10 centimeters narrower than he made it, it would have lost all stability and it would have simply have rolled over. So it goes from completely unstable in the water to stable in the water within a distance of 10 centimeters breadth at the waterline. On the other hand, John couldn't make the waterline much wider because the ship itself had to fit into those sheds. That distance from there to there had to fit in between those columns, and it had to be less than about 5.8 meters. So it's a very tight fit in the sheds, and he was only able to design, as I say, within very tight parameters. The rest was really details. The sort of main weapon, the main armament of the ship was the ram at the bow. It's actually the ramming timbers at the bow. Those timbers at the bow were covered in a bronze sheathing, and when Olympias was constructed, when this reconstruction was made in the mid-1980s, there was only one ram which had been found in the ancient Mediterranean, which had definitely come from the bottom of the sea. This was the ᶑᵃᵉ found off the coast of Israel around about 1980 from a larger ship, the Trireme, now in the Tel Aviv Museum. And this was used as the model for the ram of Olympias. Very importantly, this ram seems to have broken off the bows of a larger warship, and when it broke off a fair amount of the timber from inside, including some of the planking, which is how we know for certain that warships were built in the same way as merchant ships, with mortise and tenon joints. The actual ram structure is here. It's basically an extension of the main strakes at the side of a ship and the stem post and the keel. So when you run into another ship, the ramming force is dispersed along the hull. The bronze sheathing is simply to protect those timbers and give them a little bit of a cutting edge. We now know, because more rams have come up from the Mediterranean since 1980, that probably our ram was not just too big for the ᶑᵃᵉ is not just too big for a trireme. This whole shape is probably too big for a trireme. In fact, we now have at least 10 rams, but more and more are being found off Sicily. 7 of those 10, I think, were found in the last 3 years off Sicily, and they've not even been fully published yet. It looks as if our ram should have been rather stubbier. This is broken off at the top, but it's a rather stubbier type of ram than this thing, so it should be just a little thing about that long. This is a later type of ram. Nevertheless, that gives you an idea of how it fits on the bows of a ship. There's the keel, there's the main strakes, and there's the stem post coming into it. Another detail is the thing that puzzled John Morrison right back at the beginning, what this undergirding was. Originally it was thought to be a rope that wrapped round the hull of a ship, because short round merchant ships were known to have tried to sort of keep the planking of the hull together by wrapping ropes around them. This is something known as frapping. Frapping won't work on a long, narrow ship. And John Coates came to the conclusion that this undergirding had to be something called a hogging truss. This is a rope that runs from the bow to the stern of a ship to stop it hogging. Most ships will sort of bend like that after they've been built. Indeed, ours has quite a lot. And that's known as hogging. And to counter that, you need to run a rope from the bow to the stern. We know this was done in antiquity. We know they used hempen ropes. We know they carried spare hempen ropes. We know that these ropes had to be tensioned, pretty much on a daily basis as the hempen fibres relaxed. Indeed, when we built our reconstruction, John Coates couldn't, although he thought this is what the ᶑᵃᵉ was, he couldn't work out a safe way of attaching a hempen rope. So in our ship we used a steel rope instead, which ran from the bows to the stern. And we know that in rough water this thing did indeed flex. It had a gauge on it, and when we got into rough water you could actually see that the whole thing was flexing, because the gauge would swing from one sort of red section to the other red section, because it was moving quite a lot. The trouble with steel ropes is that when a hempen rope breaks, it just sort of breaks and sags and it doesn't whip around. A steel rope, when it breaks, will flail around. The problem with that is that this is where our lowest level of rowers were sitting. So had this thing broken, it would have decapitated all 54 of our lowest level of rowers. So it was hugely over-engineered. And could take much greater strains than it was ever likely to meet with. Nevertheless, it was one of those worries we had about the reconstruction. It's okay, it's never broken. This is one that our oarsmen particularly objected to. Any rowers in the room? Right, when you row, which side of the pin, well, you've probably never used a pin, but where does the oar go relative to the pin? Pardon? Astern of the pin. Right. Well, our oars are attached bowards of the pin. So instead of pushing against the pin, they're actually pulling on the pin via a lever or hempen rope. Our volunteer oarsmen hated it. They just didn't believe it. Trouble is, all the ancient evidence, all the visual evidence points to this being how it was done in antiquity, and indeed it is still what is used in the Mediterranean today on fishing boats. But they absolutely hated having the oar loop wrapped around the pin and the oar to the bows of a pin. And to be fair, it is problematical. Our leather oar loops did stretch rather a lot. We found rope worked best, but that doesn't fit in with the ancient evidence. There's something we don't fully understand. We tried rawhide. The trouble with rawhide is it's fine when it's wet, but when it dries it becomes absolutely solid, and you can't do anything with it. But anyway, it was one of the remaining puzzles. The sails, we have a lot of information about ancient sails. We know that they were controlled with ropes which ran up over the yard and down through little lead rings sewn into the front face of the sail. It allowed you to adjust the sail into any shape you liked. And lots of these railing rings have been found all over Mediterranean harbours, little lead rings. What's interesting is all the depictions that we have from antiquity show the yard flexing like this, so it's all sort of flopping like this. But John was terrified that the yard would break and fall on the crew, and so if you look at our reconstruction, the yard arm is completely over-engineered and completely stiff like that. It's not authentic. Interestingly, I did have a yard fall on me in a Viking reconstruction at Råskilde, where they do their reconstructions archaeologically pure. And I thought, well, disaster! My God, you know, we could have been killed, health and safety and so on. But no, the Danes don't care about health and safety. They were thrilled that the ropes had broken because it proved how long their line-bast ropes would last. So a completely different mindset, and we were very lucky with our reconstruction, in that it was actually built for us by the Greek government and the Greek Navy, so it was actually commissioned into the Greek Navy. And back in the 1980s, the Hellenic Navy's health and safety was rather looser than ours. It's problematical running replica ships. There are exemptions in terms of health and safety, but clearly you can only go so far with people's lives and with volunteers' lives. The stern of the shape of the stern, all our depictions have these beautiful curving sterns, which we now understand what they're for. They help enormously in terms of launching from those ramps. But this is very typical of ancient warships, and the Olympias stern was based on this relief from Lindos in Rhodes, of a slightly later warship. There's John Morrison actually looking at the relief, and you can see that it's modelled absolutely on the Lindos relief, except that the actual angle at which the keel comes down, for that John Coates spent a summer travelling around the Peloponnese measuring the angles of Greek beaches, and he came to the conclusion that that was the correct angle. Interestingly, we now have evidence from that shed I showed you earlier, Oiniardai, that the angle is right, that the way it curves up, it does conform to what the rock cut angle is there. So a little bit of evidence to confirm what he was deducing a priori. There it is. The ship's steered by two rudders, worked through the outrigger brackets, and they have tillers at the top, and they turn in the water like that, and you operate them by pushing the tillers in and out like that, in this way. This character is ᶑᵃᵉ, who was Professor of Maritime Archaeology at Oxford and a master mariner, and he was actually thrilled to have a go at this. And there's the ship as she was finally constructed by, let's say, the Greek government and the Greek Navy. John Morrison had enormous trouble finding somebody who was prepared to put up the money to actually build one of these ships. They got the design together, they were looking for somebody to build the ship. They couldn't find a sponsor, but John was very persistent. He got a lot of money together for Wilson College, Cambridge. He was very good at fundraising. And the way he eventually got the ship built was he got in contact with the Greek Ministry of Culture, which wouldn't normally have helped, except at that time the Greek Minister of Culture was an actress by the name of Melina Mercouri, who was enormously influential in Greece and still is of blessed memory. There are statues all over Athens to her. And she got excited by the whole idea, and she decided that the Greek Ministry of Culture and the Navy were going to build this ship, and because she said so, it got built. And I don't think any other Greek Minister of Culture could have done that. It was just luck and persistence. And as I say, we also got lucky because we were able to run this ship as a naval ship, which helped in all sorts of ways with insurance. You can't insure a warship, so it's the slight downside was when we brought it to the Thames in 1993. When you bring any ship up the Thames, the captain has to hand over control to a river pilot. But captains of warships can't do that. So we had a captain who didn't know what he was doing, going up a tidal river he'd never been on, and he's from the Mediterranean where there are no tides, and it was all quite interesting. Sort of negotiating the bridges of the Thames in particular. We did very nearly hit Westminster Bridge at one stage. That's all. And there, just to show you the outrigger backers at the top, middle level of oars, and the lowest level of oars. And really that's actually where I came in. The ship was launched in '87. I'd already become involved. I'd been at Henley Royal Regatta in the summer of 1985, where Coates and Morrison had done a sort of mock-up of this oar system, and I was looking at it thinking, this will never work. And this old guy sort of came and stood next to me, and we got chatting, and it was John Morrison. Within half an hour he persuaded me to get a crew together and actually teach them to do this. But that was the problem. Because there you see 85 oars separated in the water by about a foot, 30 centimetres. There was another 85 the other side. How do you coordinate that? Nobody's rowed one of these things since AD 324, as far as we know. And so I and my fellow rowing masters, in fact the first year I didn't go on the ship because I was ill, so my fellow rowing masters did quite a lot of the working out, but then I was there in subsequent years. Had to work out how to operate the ship. And there you see, here we've got the rowers in the ship, and they have their own problems. Here at the top are the Thrannites. The oars are a fairly sort of steep angle, which we thought was going to be a problem, but actually turned out not to be. Although interestingly, some of them started rowing with one hand underneath, one on top, and switched it around, but that's actually shown in some ancient reliefs, so that seemed to sort of work quite nicely. They can see what their oars are doing. They've got a great view of the Aegean, nice breeze, all very nice. Middle level of rowers, not quite so good. They can see up and down the ship, but they can't see out of it. They don't get quite as much air, a little bit sort of ruffling their hair, but they're not too bad. Down here is the people who are having a real problem, and that's the most cramped area of the ship. It's where we put all the smallest people, which in practice meant it's where we put most of the girls as well. The large girls we did put up on top. It was simply done by size. But there it was really quite difficult. They couldn't see out. They couldn't see up and down the ship because of the cross beams on which these guys are sitting. Very unpleasant down there. It's August. All these people are sweating profusely, and all the sweat just sort of drips down on top of the guys in the bottom. And after 2 or 3 days, it starts to smell down there. We used to wash the ship out every 2 or 3 days, I think every third day. Now we assume that in antiquity people didn't worry quite as much about this, but our volunteer students found it fairly trying. The real problem, however, for these people was that if any of these people made a mistake and their oars crossed over the oar shafts down below, they would force them into the water. The people at the bottom would lose control of the oar handle. It would hit them under the chin and pin them against the beam. And this really, the first year of trials, it really did look as if something was terribly wrong. And we'd wasted, what was it? £875,000 worth of the Greek taxpayers' money on a reconstruction that didn't work. Maybe it was only $750,000. Yeah, maybe $750,000 of probably euros I'm thinking of. Anyway, so that was very worrying. But by the second series of trials in 1988, we'd worked out how to release people when they were trapped. We'd worked. It turned out to be fairly simple as long as nobody panicked. we'd worked out that if you tied a restrainer rope onto the oar handle off a crossbeam, it would prevent the oar going back too far and causing any damage. But most interesting of all, as they got better at it, the problem disappeared because these people no longer made the mistakes. Very quickly they learned how to avoid causing the problem in the first place, and it ceased to be an issue simply by experience. The way we coordinated them, however, was a problem. If you're the rowing master, I was one of the rowing masters, and you stand up on deck, you can't really see the oars. You can just see the oars here because we're on the sail. But if the oars are actually in the water, you can't see them from up here. So if you go down in the gangway, you can see what the rowers are doing, but you can't see what the oars are doing. If you get up on the canopy, you can see the rowers, but you can't see the oars at the same time. If you wanted to see the oars, you had to sort of look over the side. Notice we had no side railings or anything like this. So again, health and safety, that was one of the really interesting things. The whole ship looked like a death trap. You looked at it and thought, somebody's gonna fall in or break a leg or whatever. And yet, in all the years we trialled it, the worst we got was somebody falling off his canopy down into this area and some bruising. And the reason was, everybody could see it was a death trap, so nobody moved without looking what they were doing. You could see people put their feet in front of them very deliberately. And it was real eye-opener. But actually it wasn't nearly as dangerous as it looked. So if you wanted to see what the oars were doing, you had to sort of kneel down and take a look over the side. And if you actually wanted to change something, you had to stick your head over the deck, talk to the guy at the top, who talked to the guy next down, who talked to the guy further down. And that's actually how they learnt to coordinate it in that the vertical groups of three would work together and move together with each other, and then they'd learn to move with the people either side of them, and we gradually built it up like that. When you did look over the side, that's what you saw. Chaos. And trying to tell, it was quite difficult to work out who to tell what to do about it. We did try sticking little labels with numbers on the shafts, but they washed off. Or because the rowers quickly realised that the oar shafts were circular, they just turned their oars over so you couldn't actually read them. So we nevertheless, we tried. It was also very important to give audible signals all the time. The trouble with that is the human voice wouldn't carry. I have quite a loud voice. I'm used to projecting in rooms even without these things. But if I stood at the stern, my voice would only carry to around about there, because the hull was full of human flesh. Human flesh is a very good absorber of sound. So if you stood in the middle, you could talk to the guys either side, but no more. And the whole system could get very badly knocked out of sync by a few waves. If some waves hit this side of ship, for instance, it would knock these people out of time, and then something very interesting would happen. They'd knock the next people along out of time, and you see a wave of chaos going down the ship. Except one year, when we had a really good, cohesive bunch of rowers just there, and when a wave hit, you see the wave hit this cohesive bunch, and then you'd see it ripple back. It really did reflect. It's simply astonishing. So to try and keep them in time, the voices wouldn't carry, and eventually, in the second year of trials, we decided we had to put in electronic loudspeakers. So we put 6 electronic loudspeakers in the ship and spoke to the crew through a microphone, and that allowed us to keep them in time. The trouble with that, of course, is we're fairly certain that wasn't authentic. And then we got lucky. Waterproof speakers weren't very good in the mid-80s, and ours got waterlogged, and they ceased to work just as we were trying to manoeuvre the ship into the dockside. And all of a sudden we lost control of all the oars and so on, and my fellow rowing master who was running the ship on the day sent me forward to round about here, and he stood here, and basically we read each other's lips and gestured together, and together we were able to give the same command simultaneously to keep the crew together, and it worked really well. So much so that from then on we used to sabotage the speakers at least once every outing, so that we'd get 10 or 20 minutes while somebody pretended to try and fix them, where we could run the ship just by voice. And again, the interesting thing about that was when they lost the speakers, everything went quiet and the crew tried to listen much harder, and they concentrated more. Boredom was a real problem for the crew. After rowing half an hour or 45 minutes, the speed would drop simply because they got bored. And then we found that you could do almost anything would help them to get back together. You could read them adverts from the newspaper or anything at all, and immediately the speed would pick up by about a knot, simply because they became engaged and started rowing together again. There's my colleague speaking through a microphone. We also tried using the ancient system. We know the ancient ships each carried a flute player to play in time with the rowers. And we did get somebody from, I think, the music department at Berkeley, California, brought along an authentic reconstruction of a diaulos, a double pipe with reeds, and that didn't work very well. It sort of gave a very low pitched sound. We found we tried all sorts of things, in fact, to play to the crew to see if it would carry. The most bizarre was the drone from a Bulgarian bagpipe. Who knows how that turned out. But what worked best was a simple recorder or a penny whistle. So it had a very high-pitched sound which would just carry through the hull. And if you played along with the crew, that would help keep them in time. Indeed, if you started playing just a bit ahead of them, you could put them out of time. So we actually found ways of controlling the crew with it as well. And eventually, after 2 or 3 seasons of trials, we started to row together. I'm enormously proud of this slide, because there you've got 85 oars all out of the water at the same time. Don't know what's happening on the other side, but on this side. And she started to perform really well. This is the best photo we've ever had taken off, a wonderful photo of a ship under oar. 1992, we got to take her through the Corinth Canal, the first all-powered vessel ever to go through. We had to get special permission. Not as easy as it looks. There is a current running through the Corinth Canal, and when you're going through it, those walls look very, very close indeed. It was very scary. The naval personnel steering the ship were really quite concerned, and indeed, if things had gone wrong, we would have hit the sides quite quickly. So we went through at about 6 knots under our own power. And here you see her coming under the bridge in the Corinth Canal. John Morrison's on the deck there, I think. I think that's him on the deck. And I'm somewhere up here. Another fantastic photo. Again, very proud of this. All 170 oars out of the water at the same time, except him. We had words. That really was quite an achievement we felt. We got the ship going faster and faster. The first year, it took 3 weeks for us to get it anywhere near to 7 knots, and we could only keep it up for a couple of seconds, literally a couple of seconds. By the second year, we were doing 7 knots by the end of the first morning. By the third year, half an hour. So we learnt very quickly how to operate the ship successfully. And we got some really quite interesting performance figures out of it. We could accelerate it from 0 to 7 knots in about 30 seconds. The next 2 knots, the next knot and a half, takes another 30 seconds. And then getting her up to flat out at about 9 knots is a hell of a business. That's perfectly normal if you know anything about physics, and that's fine. We managed to cruise her at about 5 to 6 knots. That, we think, is less than the ancient crews could have done it. But I think the ancient crews trained a lot longer, were used to long distance rowing. All our oarsmen were sport oarsmen, used to wasting all their energy in 7 minutes or 5 minutes, 5.5 minutes. With our, in antiquity, I think they could have maintained these speeds much better. We got up to just about 9 knots for a few seconds. We think in antiquity they would have been able to get it up to about 9.5, 9.75, although no more than that. To give a comparative figure, when the British 8 won the Olympics in Sydney in 2000, they were averaging 11.5 knots over 2,000 metres. So 9 knots for a 50-ton, 45-ton ship, fixed seat warship is not that bad. It's not great, but it's not that bad. Turning circle, we could turn her, she's 37 metres long, we could turn her in a circle of 62 metres, but to do that you'd have to stop rowing on one side and just pull round on the other. And that would give you a very tight turning circle, but you'd lose a lot of speed. Exactly what happens with fighter planes as well, in dogfights. The manoeuvring is very similar to fighter planes. A normal turning circle where we just carry on rowing and don't lose any speed, we have a turning circle of about 3 times the length of the ship, about 110 metres. And the rate of turning is 3 degrees per second, which is exactly the same rate of turning as a modern frigate, which was interesting that it performed in those ways. So that's a big circle. So first of all, we proved that you can row a ship with 3 levels. I think beyond doubt. We never performed quite as well as we think the ancient ships did, but we don't have the same crews. We think there are things in the rowing geometry we could improve slightly to make it more effective, to close the gap. So it's not too far off what we think an ancient ship would have performed that. We learned an awful lot about the man management side and also the practicalities of running the ship. One of the practicalities is, are people drinking a litre of water an hour? If you have 170 people drinking a litre of water an hour in a 10-hour rowing day, they've drunk 1.7 tonnes of water. You have to replace that at the end of the day. How do you do it? How do you do it in antiquity? How did you get 1.7 tonnes of water for the next day on board? And there's a limit to how much you can carry. The whole thing only displaces 40 to 45 tonnes. So moving fleets of these ships is a major logistical problem. And it's certainly not as simple as the historians, even the ancient historians, make out. When you actually start reading the ancient historians, you see that they're moving these fleets in squadrons, and they have to be very careful about where they move into, that there's water and so on. And the water's the key thing. Go back. So we learned a lot about the performance, a lot about how to operate it. We think we've proved that the three-level system is workable, and therefore there's no real objection to this reconstruction. And actually, ironically, this is now used whenever anybody wants to illustrate a trireme. They use a photo of our ship. And the trouble is, we know it's an experiment. It's an archaeological experiment. That professor of maritime archaeology I showed you, ฐ์ᵃᵚ, came up with a perfect description of what this ship is. It's a floating hypothesis. The trouble is, people no longer think of it as a hypothesis. It's become a factoid. So it's very difficult to question. And also, it's very difficult to replicate the experiment because it costs $750,000. So it's not perfect. We think it's right, but it's not perfect. Just to finish off, it was operated every year until 1994, and then it was taken out of the water, put in a museum in ឋᵃᵃ near the Piraeus, and it was cleaned up, the varnish was taken off, and it was put in the water briefly, and without the varnish it was very quickly attacked by something called Teredo nivalis. Teredo nivalis is shipworm, Mediterranean shipworm. It's actually a little clam which sort of chomps its way into the wood. And by the time it's finished with your wood, in 6 weeks it can reduce your hull to a honeycomb, and that's what it did. This is not actually part of our hull, but this, sorry, that was later. So that had to be, the planking had to be removed and replaced. It was then put back on the land, out in the open. It was rained on, the sun shone on it, the upper timbers dried out, the rain seeped into the mortise and tenon joints, and fungi blew off nearby trees, and it started being attacked by fungal disease. And that's all being done by fungus. And when we caught that in 2002, the ship probably had about a year to go before being completely eaten away. So it had to be refurbished. More fungal damage. Horrible, horrible stuff. Had to be completely refurbished in 2003 because they wanted to use it for the Athens Olympics, to carry the Olympic flame. When they refurbished it, however, they didn't use the original type of reconstruction. It was, they inserted extra frames and additional stringers, so more like the northern style of ship reconstruction, which meant that it's not as strong as it was. There's it out of water just after the refurbishment. It was then put in a shed to keep the wind and the rain off it in 2004, and that has helped to preserve it, but unfortunately it has again started to rot again. We hoped we were going to get it refurbished in order to bring it to London for the 2012 Olympics. The London Organising Committee asked us whether we could get it to the Thames again for 2012, so we found sponsors and so on, and then Λᵃᵏ pulled out in the January before the Olympics. But organising committees of the Olympic Games have a tendency to do that. Ask anybody who's ever worked with them. So it was actually ended up being half repaired, and that's where she is now, in a shed. Her ram off, you can see some water rotting for where water has been trapped behind the ram. The varnish is all gone. She's a bit dry, but she's okay. There's quite a lot of planking, needs replacing, and we're working to see whether we can find whether there's a chance of getting her finished off. The Navy may be interested in doing repair to allow her to become a proper museum exhibit again. We'll know in March. March is the key date because the entire Hellenic Navy staff changes over every 2 years in March. It's sort of very political, but hopefully we'll get her fixed up. Whether they'll ever let us take her to sea again, we don't know. We'd love to take her to sea again to do a few more experiments, and also because one of the things we never did was actually used her for ramming. The Hellenic Navy were afraid that we'd damage her if we hit something, and every year we asked them whether we could ram something. They said no. And we'd ask the captain every year, he said no. And then one year, 1990, we asked the captain, can we go and ram something? He said, yeah, sure. So we all put in, I think, $3 US, and we bought a fishing boat. And we were ready to ram this fishing boat. But unfortunately, the captain told the head of the base, and the head of the base called naval headquarters in Athens, which wonderfully the Greeks called the Pentagon. And they said, no, sorry, you can't ram anything. But maybe if they let us take her out again, we'll finally get a chance to do it. I'm sorry I've overrun, but I will stop there.